In the year 1700, a physician in Madrid stood over the body of a king and prepared to perform an autopsy. He had seen dead men before. He had seen diseased men before. But he had never seen this. The body on the table belonged to Charles II of Spain. He was 39 years old, but he looked 80. He was bald, toothless, and crippled. And when the physician opened him up, he didn't find a monarch. He found a biological crime scene. The report he wrote is one of the most brutal documents in human history. He noted that the king's heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. His kidneys were choked with 3 massive stones. But it gets worse. Dr. Bernardo noted that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. And when he opened the skull, he didn't find a brain. He found a cavity full of water. Let that sink in. The King of Spain had been ruling the largest empire on earth with a heart the size of a seed, no blood, and a head full of fluid. And, my personal favorite detail, the report concluded by noting he possessed a single testicle, black as coal. This wasn't a man. This was a collection of spare parts that had been screaming for 39 years, and he possessed a genetic code so tangled that a modern DNA test would mistake him for the child of a brother and sister. Because the Habsburgs didn't believe in marrying strangers, they believed in marrying cousins and nieces and uncles. They spent 2 centuries trying to keep their blood pure, and in the end, they succeeded. They created a king so pure he couldn't walk until he was 4, couldn't speak until he was 8, and couldn't chew his own food because his jaw was designed by a committee of people who had never seen a human face. Welcome to the Habsburgs. Let's talk about how to destroy a dynasty without firing a single shot. To understand Charles, we have to stop looking at him as a person for a moment and look at him as a result, a final sum in a mathematical equation that had been running for 200 years. The Habsburgs didn't marry their cousins because they were perverts. They did it because they were efficient. They treated marriage the way modern corporations treat mergers. Why let a valuable asset, like, say, the Kingdom of Bohemia, leave the family just because your daughter fell in love with a French duke? No, you marry her to her uncle. The land stays in the ledger. The borders stay secure. It was rational. It was strategic. It was also biological suicide. For generations, the loop tightened. First cousins married first cousins. Then uncles married nieces. Fresh blood wasn't just discouraged, it was treated like a security breach. And then we get to Charles. Geneticists have a number for this. It's called the inbreeding coefficient. It measures how likely it is that you inherited the exact same gene from both parents because they share a common ancestor. If 2 random people on the street have a child, that number is effectively 0. If first cousins have a child, that number is 0.0625. If a brother and sister, the ultimate taboo, the thing that makes us recoil instinctively, have a child, that number is 0.25. Charles II, his number was 0.254. Let that sink in. Through the sheer, relentless compounding of family marriages, Charles II was more genetically compromised than the offspring of a brother and sister. His family tree didn't branch, it spiraled. He had 4 great-grandparents instead of 8, and all of them were descendants of the same woman, Joanna the Mad, which, as foreshadowing goes, is a bit on the nose, even for history. So when Charles was born, he wasn't just a sick baby. He was a collapsing star. The doctors didn't know about DNA. They didn't know about recessive genes, but they knew that when they looked at the infant king, nature was screaming at them. The dynasty had ignored the warning signs for centuries, and now the bill had finally arrived. So, what does life look like when you are a walking genetic error? It looks like fear. From the moment he drew breath, the Spanish court was terrified of him, not because he was dangerous, but because he was fragile. Imagine a child who is effectively made of glass. Charles couldn't walk until he was 4 years old. His legs simply wouldn't support him. He couldn't speak until he was 8. And when he did speak, that famous jaw got in the way. His tongue was so enlarged, a condition called macroglossia, that he could barely chew. Eating was a chore. Talking was a struggle. He drooled constantly. And the courtiers, the dukes, the counts, the ladies in waiting, had to stand there in their silks and velvets and pretend not to notice. Behind closed doors, the gossip was vicious. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters home that were less diplomatic updates and more horror stories. The French ambassador reported that the king was so weak his bones seemed to rattle when he moves. They treated him not as a future monarch, but as a ticking clock. How long do we have? Will he make it to 10? Will he make it to 20? Every day he survived was another year Spain postponed the problem. He was breastfed until he was 5 or 6 years old, not for nutrition, but because wet nurses were the only ones who could calm him down during his fits. He wasn't educated. No tutors, no lessons in history or strategy. Why bother? The Queen Mother, Mariana, decided that thinking might overheat his brain. So the ruler of the Spanish Empire was left to wander the palace halls, playing with dwarfs and dogs, unable to read the treaties being signed in his name. He was a ghost in his own life, protected, hidden, and profoundly, deeply alone. By the time Charles technically took the throne, the Spanish court had a problem. They looked at their king, who suffered from seizures, hallucinations, and bouts of profound confusion, and they needed an explanation. A modern doctor would say, "This man has Klinefelter syndrome, hydrocephalus, and renal failure." The Spanish court said, "Witchcraft." Obviously, because admitting that the royal family had inbred themselves into a biological corner would be treason. Blaming a curse? That's just politics. So Charles became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. And this is where the story shifts from comedy to psychological horror, because Charles believed them. He was raised to believe he was a vessel for demons. Instead of medical treatment, they brought in exorcists. Priests shouted Latin at a man who was just trying to eat his soup without choking. They dug up the bodies of his ancestors to break the curse. They made him sleep with the dried entrails of saints under his pillow. At one point, poor Charles was convinced that his own body was failing because someone had given him a cup of chocolate cursed with the brains of a dead criminal. Which, to be fair, is a fantastic rumor, and I wish modern politics had that level of creativity. But think about the toll that takes. To be told every day that your pain is not biological, but spiritual. That you are suffering because God is angry or because the devil is interested. Charles wasn't just sick, he was terrified. He lived in a world of shadows, spells, and dead relatives. And while the priests were busy chasing ghosts, the rest of Europe was busy watching the clock. Every other monarch in Europe, specifically Louis XIV of France, was looking at Spain like a vulture looking at a gazelle that has tripped over its own legs. They were just waiting for him to die. But Charles, in a final act of spite against the universe, refused to do it quickly. He lingered, and that created a new problem. He needed a wife. While the priests were shouting Latin in the bedroom, the real horror was happening in the embassies, because Charles II wasn't just a man, he was a landlord. He owned Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, and the vast gold-rich expanse of the Americas. And every other monarch in Europe was watching him die with a calculator in their hand. In London, Paris, and Amsterdam, gambling houses actually took bets on the king's life expectancy. The odds shifted with every medical report. If Charles had a seizure on Tuesday, the betting markets in London moved by Wednesday. He was the world's most expensive dead pool. In Versailles, Louis XIV wasn't sending get-well cards, he was sending surveyors. And in Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs, his own family, were already drafting the paperwork to claim his corpse. Diplomats didn't even pretend to be polite anymore. They signed treaties dividing up the Spanish Empire while Charles was still trying to eat his dinner. The first partition treaty, the second partition treaty. They carved up his lands, traded his cities, and swapped his subjects like poker chips. It is a uniquely humiliating way to live, to sit on a throne and know that the people bowing to you are mentally measuring the room for the next guy. Charles knew it. He reportedly flew into rages when he heard about the treaties. "I am not dead yet," he would scream. But to Europe, he was. He was a walking vacancy sign. Charles was not ruling an empire. He was delaying its auction. And the only way to stop the auction? Produce an heir. The vultures were circling, and the only weapon Charles had left was biology. In 1679, the diplomats decided that Charles needed to breed, which is a sentence that should have been illegal to write. Expecting Charles II to produce an heir was like expecting a toaster to solve a crossword puzzle. The machinery simply was not designed for that function. But treaties are treaties. So they found him a bride, Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was French, she was beautiful, she was vivacious, and when she was told she had to marry Charles II of Spain, she publicly wept. She begged her uncle, Louis XIV, not to send her. Louis, being the warm, fuzzy family man he was, told her, "My dear, the Queen of Spain has no reason to cry." Translation: pack your bags, your political currency. The moment Marie-Louise arrived in Madrid, the fairy tale died screaming. The Spanish court was rigid, gloomy, and obsessed with protocol. And her husband? Charles fell madly, obsessively in love with her. But it was the love of a terrified child. He stared at her constantly. He followed her around the palace. He panicked if she left the room. Marie-Louise wasn't a wife. She was an emotional support human. And the pressure on her was crushing. Every morning the court asked, "Are you pregnant yet?" Every month the answer was no, because, and I cannot stress this enough, the king was barely functional. The French ambassador wrote home with brutal honesty, saying, "The king is so weak that his body lacks the heat required for generation," which is a very polite 17th century way of saying, "It's not happening, lads." Marie-Louise became depressed. She grew fat on candied sweets to comfort herself. She spent 10 years trapped in a golden cage with a man who worshipped her but couldn't talk to her. And then, at age 26, she died, probably of appendicitis. But because this is the Spanish court, everyone shouted, "Poison!" Charles was devastated. He reportedly cried out, "Her Highness has died, and I shall soon follow her." He didn't. He lived for another 11 years. If Marie-Louise was a tragedy, the second wife was a farce. Enter Maria Anna of Neuburg, German, fertile, and possessing a personality made of sandpaper and ambition. Marie-Louise had been asked to love Charles, to soothe him, to absorb his fear, to stand quietly beside a man collapsing under the weight of his own bloodline and call it duty. Maria Anna of Neuburg had no such illusions. She did not arrive in Madrid to comfort a broken king. She arrived to run the place. Where Marie-Louise wept in private, Maria Anna performed in public. Where the first queen endured, the second calculated. She looked at Charles, sick, confused, childlike, and saw not a husband, but an opportunity. And unlike Marie-Louise, who had been slowly consumed by the role, Maria Anna intended to consume him. She didn't fear Charles. She bullied him. She faked pregnancies to keep the court on their toes, political theatre to keep her enemies guessing. She stole money. She sold offices. She fought with Charles's mother in screaming matches that echoed down the halls of the Escorial. Imagine, if you will, the poor king, sick, confused, surrounded by exorcists, and now trapped in a house with a wife who hates him and a mother who hates his wife. It is the sitcom from hell. By the late 1690s, Charles was decomposing while still alive. His hair fell out, he went deaf, he lost his teeth. The Habsburg jaw became so pronounced he could barely speak. He spent his days wandering the cold halls of the monastery, occasionally demanding to have the coffins of his ancestors opened so he could look at them. He once reportedly kissed the preserved corpse of his first wife, Marie-Louise, which is, well, it's romantic, if your definition of romance comes from a Gothic horror novel written by a lunatic. Finally, in November 1700, the end arrived. The doctors, who had done absolutely nothing helpful for 39 years, gathered round. The priests, who had failed to exorcise the genetics, chanted their prayers. And Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, whispered his final will. He didn't have a child. He didn't have a legacy. All he had was a choice. Who gets the world, France or Austria? In his final moments, clarity seemed to return to him, or maybe just spite. He signed the paper. He left everything, to the grandson of Louis XIV, to France, the enemy. Why? Because he knew France was the only power strong enough to keep the Spanish Empire together. He didn't care about blood anymore. He cared about the map. It was the one intelligent political decision of his life, and he waited until his deathbed to make it. He died on November 1st, 1700. The autopsy report, the peppercorn heart, was written, and the Spanish Habsburg line, which had ruled for 2 centuries, blinked out like a candle in a drafty room. The result? War, obviously. The War of the Spanish Succession. The shockwave of the will hit Europe before the mourning period had even begun. Armies mobilized, alliances shattered, millions died, maps were redrawn, all because a family refused to date outside their own zip code. So the next time you feel like your family is dysfunctional, just remember Charles II. Remember the wreath, and be grateful that your jaw actually closes.